Greetings, everyone. My name is Ricardo Miguel Silva, and my official role at OutSystems is Senior Developer Marketing Manager. But what I really do, day in and day out, is advocate and evangelize for developers. And I mean it when I say for developers and not just to developers, even though that is also a big and important part of my job. In my professional life, in one way or another, I've always been around or working with developers. Just at OutSystems, before I took on my current role, I worked alongside delivery teams as the evangelist of their work and content. So I got to witness and document the relationship between development teams and their respective business counterparts. I helped manage a team of content specialists and knowledge managers in technical documentation and training. So I've been in close contact with our body of developers and myriad complaints coming from their side, mostly from the lack of acknowledgement or recognition. And a funny thing there, when they were indeed acknowledged and heard, they acted as if they were surprised. And that's because developers are humans, and you might even know or be one too. Not only for being around them, but because I really appreciate them as well. I know for a fact that developers are human, very deeply human. And from my past experience, ever since my first job out of college, and the fact that I've been around computers ever since I was four, I believe they're a special kind. I've seen it with my very own eyes, and I've suffered alongside them as well. But one of the most common aspects of software developers is that they're constantly dehumanized. Images of basement dwellers typing mindlessly with four or five screens stacked in front of them, pale, disheveled, unapproachable. Pop culture to blame for the stereotype a little bit, even if developers have learned to make fun of themselves and of that perception as well. The ability to focus their brain power on something tends to have people perceive them as these enigmatic people with whom it's really difficult to communicate. So we need to start by cleaning up this perception a little bit before we move forward. Let's start by saying this very clearly. Not everyone can be a developer. I truly believe that to be a proficient developer, one needs to have a level of abstraction, organization, and comprehension that few other jobs need. And I'm not discounting other types of engineering, for instance, though some programming is also engineering. I'm not discounting astrophysics, theoretical physics, advanced mathematics, the lot. I'm just acknowledging developers as the very special people that they are. Good ones don't just fall from trees, and great ones are truly few and far between. But one of the usual struggles developers have due to the nature of their work is how to communicate with the rest of the world, with anyone who's not a developer as well. The way they see and think the world usually makes it so they're more comfortable amongst their developer kin. There are also developers out there who excel at communicating, but their numbers might still not be enough to shatter that prototype. They're a rarity. Those who've learned that skill, communication, they have acquired part of a competitive edge. And what we're here to talk about today is exactly about that. How every developer can acquire a competitive edge that complements their skill and expertise and redefines internal culture in a way that makes them leaders in their own right, who excel at driving innovation. All of that, in turn, is a boon for every single organization on the enhancement of developer productivity and the reduction of wasted cycles. I don't want to get drawn into the approach of just mindlessly extolling the virtues of low code or modern application development platforms such as OutSystems, but we need to clarify why specifically we call them just that. At the end of the day, platforms such as ours are especially catered to enhance productivity. They enable developers to build more in less time. They enable smaller teams to be as productive as bigger traditional dev teams. Without delving into very low-level details, let me explain why, and while using OutSystems in particular as an example. So we're built on the observations, research, and learning years upon years of programming standards, of the apprehension and consolidation of patterns observed throughout the years, of development best practices encapsulated into a modern language, into what we believe is the future of the act of programming. Due to the safety that these tried and true abstractions provide, it's truly possible to create technically robust enterprise-grade apps with these platforms. And this is, to begin with, what these modern platforms are for developers and ultimately for the organization. Just as a side note, we need to say that in this space, it's usual to call Java, .NET, Python, Ruby, any high-level programming languages that have been around for some time as legacy development languages and platforms, as compared and opposed to no-code, low-code, or even modern application development platforms. We also clearly want to dispel the notion that these so-called traditional or legacy languages haven't kept on evolving as well, because those traditional hand coding languages have frameworks and libraries, reusable components, AI co-pilots that help inform the development process as it goes, and so much more. They're not just text-based copy and paste assemblies of code snippets. Watching a proficient .NET developer programming nowadays would leave a .NET developer of the olden days completely slack-jawed. And still, in terms of efficiency and productivity, these languages and platforms have some never-ending catching up to do. Though not all platforms are built the same, and some are more limited than others, though. Only solutions which present constraints rather than possibilities will limit developers to doing strictly what the tools can offer. And that's why we clearly differentiate between low code, for instance, and no code, and why they're catered to offer different capabilities. In any event, these platforms' approach is to bring the tried and true, compliant and robust part and handle its heavy lifting for developers, not just automatically, not just in a black box, but in a way that's accelerated for them through the abstraction of the coding needed to attain that heavy lifting, in the shape then of model-driven visual programming models. This way, we make sure that the virtues of the really good programmers out there aren't focused mostly where they're not visible, like icebergs of code. We want developers to be able to build something great and visible, and everything we do for them is to help that out, to accelerate and enhance that process. Above all things, good professional developers strive for efficiency and productivity. They want to be perfect in their trade, but at the end of the day, they want to deliver more and more. And their languages or frameworks of choice are usually the ones with which they can do both: create perfect code and deliver faster. So then you have to acknowledge what makes a developer special, and that it's not the platform that makes a developer. You see, the genius of being a developer is in code design, in the way it flows together, in its architecture, in how it integrates and works seamlessly, in the way it's set for being maintained and improved, in its performance. Developers are not relinquishing their craft, as they can still make use of their expertise. But the bulk of the systems are built on top of stuff that is very repetitive, very replicable, that doesn't warrant their finely crafted code. And even in times where it does warrant their finely crafted code, certain platforms then offer the possibility of extending the platform's out-of-the-box capabilities with their very own code or integrations. What we truly believe is that productivity and efficiency come mostly from no wasted cycles of that very special developer brainpower. Make no mistake, though, a bad developer with a great tool, still a bad developer. But it's way, way harder being a bad developer with OutSystems, for instance. With these types of platforms, a good developer has the potential to be an incredibly productive and efficient developer. Even when we're talking specifically about developer productivity, people tend to think just about the act of programming and the acceleration that these platforms bring to that process. But they rarely think about all the moments that precede that, or how these platforms can also enhance their responsiveness and understanding to the demands of the business. What we're looking at establishing here is an inversion of that paradigm. Let me clarify. Usually the pressure comes from the business. They define a business vision, they establish and communicate their requirements in a way they believe can be picked up cleanly by development teams. And then even the most agile of teams, when they're indeed agile, will struggle to keep up with the ever-changing requirements and the pace at which changes will need to be introduced. So there are only two types of development teams that don't struggle with the backlog. Teams with a disproportionate number of resources, or teams that I don't know of. So what happens when you give developers the power to be more productive and when you free them from the hamster wheel of the daily grind? And on top of that, give them a tool that enables them to communicate clearly and involve their business counterparts in the entire process. Developer productivity doesn't just have returns in the fact that developers are more productive in the act of programming, the isolated act of programming. It's by inverting the usual paradigm where the business piles requirements on development teams and making those teams more responsive to the point that they are the ones putting pressure on the business to deliver those requirements. It's by then removing the stress of that strained relationship where they manage to get involved in the definition of requirements, but are working alongside the business units, creating in conjunction and making sure that nothing gets lost in translation, in constant acceleration, compounded by feeding off each other, by the enablement of those conversations to happen. It's by being able to give smaller development teams a higher capacity to deliver than much bigger traditional development teams. It's by them being harbingers of innovation, whereby their deep involvement and their understanding of the business requirements, they manage to advance new technical solutions and much faster. So let's rewind a little bit and understand how developers can lead in the context of an organization, how how the fact that they can become central instead of peripheral figures can benefit the organization. In 2019, Gartner conducted research that recognized the importance of cross-functional team structures in order to attain higher productivity, higher chance of successful product launches. Tools and platforms in the realm of low code enable teams to establish common ground by bridging the gap between the technical and the non-technical roles involved in those product launches. In an enterprise environment, software development teams are still seen and understood a wee bit as being the others, as I'd mentioned before. So in the enterprise version of the othering phenomenon, developers are perceived as this strange and difficult people to whom they have to communicate things they want to see done, shaped in the form of software that will then benefit the organization either internally or externally. But the reality of things is that the moments that shape software, starting from its business vision down to the definition and handover of requirements and their implementation, those are some of the worst possible examples of communication from these very diverse worlds, comprising people who speak eminently different languages. There's a lot lost in translation. There's a whole lot of inefficiency in those processes. So how can low code, no code, modern platforms help? First of all, it's down to basic psychology. Intrinsic motivation involves performing tasks because they're personally rewarding to you. Extrinsic motivation involves completing a task or exhibiting a behavior because of outside causes, such as avoiding punishment or receiving a reward. Hence the names, intrinsic when the motivation comes from within, extrinsic when the motivation comes from the outside. Developers often love coding because it provides intrinsic motivation. They truly derive pleasure from the very fact that they're coding, but not always when they're not involved, when they're not helping define exactly what they're coding. In true team fashion, when there's no our side versus the other side, feeling involved in the process makes not only the buy-in easier, but definition closer to being a translation of the vision that the business had to start with, which is then informed and shaped by development teams. When you bridge the gap between both worlds and have teams working in true collaboration, there are no different parts to the same project. They're effectively working on the same thing from start to finish. And that in turn makes the reward intrinsic and not just extrinsic, which in the long term is proven to be more effective in the pursuit of goals and the completion of tasks in what we believe is a much more fulfilling way. This is what we call helping those who shape the business vision and the development teams who implement it in the shape of applications meet in the middle. How can modern platforms help? By also giving developers a competitive edge. And this is all fine and dandy, But what's the big difference there? Why can't this just be done with other development tools already? The so-called traditional or legacy tools, for instance. So we've established before that what modern application platforms bring to the table is an altogether different order of magnitude in terms of sheer speed that even those ever-evolving traditional platforms still cannot match and never will. It's a head start that they just can't catch. The best way to describe that is actually through a metaphor that our CEO, Paulo Rosado, uses to provide color as to what OutSystems brings to the table. We are to developers what power tools are for house builders. Sure, they could build an entire house by hand and could be perfect, but by the time they'd be finishing the house, it might already warrant maintenance anyway. So no one builds houses entirely by hand these days. Even people who build three houses for their kids, they use some sort of power tool. But even when you use those, that's still not in the scale that these platforms provide, because building large enterprise grade applications with just traditional languages in the future will be akin to building a condo with a hammer. And don't forget, as an important side note that we keep repeating, with or without power tools or large-scale building tools, a bad builder, still a bad builder. Someone who isn't a builder won't immediately get transformed into a builder just by using those power tools either. And finally, we have what we call the flywheel effect. So the true disruption comes from the clever way developers can do it and bring non-technical roles into the development process. So the translation layer that modern platforms present enables a deeper collaboration where requirements aren't just delivered, yet collaborated upon. Most importantly, we enable a faster cadence of communication, so much so that changes can sometimes just be introduced in real time, on the fly, and iterated upon instantly. Developers are not expected to sit diligently waiting for requirements to come their way and then retreating to the background to work on top of those requirements, eventually delivering something in weeks or months, depending on the scale of the project, that may or may not even completely fit the initial vision that was communicated to them. True differentiation comes when developers now have the ability to also speak the language of the business to make their work more effective. By collaborating with the business more closely, the time sitting idly waiting for change to come is completely mitigated on both sides. And though we've said before that not everyone can be a developer, what we're actually saying here is that the low code and no code type of platforms enable everyone to be deeply involved in the development process. In fact, while not everyone has the traditional role of a developer, everyone involved in the process is indeed a developer. This eventually leads to what we call the flywheel effect. Full team collaboration, business units and developer teams collaborating not just in unison, but in synergy, feeding off each other, pushing each other in a compound effect of acceleration and speed of change. So in sum, shared sense of belonging to the project, the reduction of time in introducing changes to requirements, faster iterations, faster time to market, enabling innovation built on top of technical soundness because they're informed and shaped by the business in conjunction with technical teams. This all equals the best of both worlds, working hand in hand in harmony. There's a reason Gartner has predicted that by 2025, 70% of all new applications developed by companies will use either low-code or no-code technology, up from less than 25% in 2020. While not all platforms are built the same and offer the same breadth of functionality, this is a somewhat inescapable fact. The reason why is clear. The traditional way, as much as it has evolved, doesn't cut it for the scale and responsiveness of these projects. The traditional way is also not to be absolutely discarded. The artisanship is still very much needed, but the way it's used needs to change. It needs to act as a complement, not as the way the bulk of the code is created. Developers are key in driving this change and in acquiring this competitive edge, not just for themselves, but for the organization. They're key in enabling the rest of the organization to participate, because sooner or later, they'll all need to. For us, this is just an absolute conversation starter. in about 20 minutes. We hope that this at least helps see the conversation. Thank you for joining me today. It was a true pleasure. Hope to speak to you all soon. Cheers.